Hi and welcome to Shanghai Maths with Auntie Lottie. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 16.12, Quadratic Surds, the first section, fill in the blanks. So let's get started. When we're looking at this one, we want to look at a condition that makes it true. Now the only way that this is going to be true is if it's going to be a real number. So we look at the two surds on their own. X and Y, in order for those to give us a real number and not imaginary, X has to be greater than or equal to 0 and Y has to be greater than or equal to 0. Otherwise it would give us an imaginary number. Looking at number 2, we've got the same principle. If we look inside our roots, we've got X has to be greater than or equal to 0, but Y, you can't have a fraction with 0 as the denominator. So therefore Y cannot equal 0, but it has to be greater than 0 in order for it to work. Looking at the next one, we've got the condition to make this equation true. Again, we shall look underneath this. And because it's the same variable, we have to think about them both, so it has to be true in both cases. So the first one, if we've got x minus 1 greater than or equal to 0, x has to be greater than or equal to 1. The second one is x plus 1 greater than or equal to 0, so x has to be greater than or equal to minus 1. Now if you think about that on a number line, so we've got minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is here, and this one is here. Now the only bit that includes them both is this part here, which means our condition, in order for it to be correct, is going to have to be x is greater than or equal to 1, because if it's here, then this condition isn't met. So it's important that they are both met. Okay, looking at question 4, it's simplify root 24x squared when x is greater than or equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is inside the root, I'm going to put it as the factors, as many square numbers as I can. So I'm going to have 4 times by x squared times by 6. And if you times them together, you get 24x squared. And then you can separate the root, so it's root 4, root x squared, root 6. Now obviously you can ignore this once you get better, it's just so that you understand where it comes from. Root 4 is 2, root x squared. Now looking at the condition, x is greater than or equal to 0, it means that this is positive, which means that it's just going to be x and then root 6. Then if we look at number 5, we want the condition to make this equation true. In order for this to be true, we need this to be a real number, otherwise it won't happen. So let's look at the first one. X has to be greater than or equal to 0. And then we've got x minus 2 greater than or equal to 0. Let me just get rid of that equal to, because it cannot have a 0 as the denominator, which means that x has to be greater than or equal greater than 2. And if you look at that on your number line, let's do x is greater than or equal to 0, x is greater than but not equal to 2, so the times when they are together is this part, which means that the condition for it to be correct, it has to be greater than 2. Okay, looking at number 6, now we want to know of these surds which can be simplified. So we have to see which ones are not in its simplest form. Root 7, there is no square number in there, so you can't simplify it any further than that, it is done. Root 30, again, there's no square number in root 30, no factors that will go into it as a square number, so that's simplified. Now root 1/2, even though there isn't a square number that times to get that, you cannot have a surd as the denominator for it to be in its simplest form. So root 1 we know is root 1, so it goes to here. Now in order to, we call it rationalising the denominator. And to do that, you times it by 1 essentially, but that's made up of the surd and the denominator, because anything divided by itself is 1. And you times anything by 1, then it'll equal itself. So 1 times root 2 is just root 2. Root 2 times root 2 is 2. So we've now simplified root 1/2 to root 2 over 2, which means that this one can be simplified. Now let's look at the others. I'm going to change colours so we can see which one it is. Root 210. Root 210, I can see there's 21 in there, so there's going to be a 3. 3 times by 70, which is 7 times by 10. There's no way in which to get a square number out of that, so therefore root 10 is fully simplified, and 210 is fully simplified. Let's look at 3 root 3a squared. Now a squared is already a square number, so we can take that out. So then we'll simplify it. Root 3 times a squared, which would give you a root 3. So root 3a squared can be simplified. Now let's look at root a squared plus b squared. There's no way of bringing it out there. Because there's an add, you can't just get rid of the square on the a and the b, because it's 2 square numbers added together. They're not multiplied together. So that one can't be simplified either. That's finished. So let's move on. Question 7. If we simplify this, if m is less than 0 and n is greater than 0. So firstly, I'm just going to split them up so you can see what's going to happen. Now m is less than 0, which means that this is negative. So when you square it, in order to make it positive, you have to minus m. And n is greater than 0, which means it's going to be a real number, but as it's not a square number, it has to say in its surd. So the answer to 7 is just minus m root n. Now let's look at 8. So simplify this if m plus absolute value of m equals 0. So firstly, in order for this to happen, this is going to be positive no matter what, because it's an absolute value, which means that this has to be negative for it to work. So m has to be less than 0, but if they are both 0, it will also be correct. So m has to be less than or equal to 0. Now if we're using that, let's look at what happens to these surds. m minus 2, if m is less than 0, would be negative, and so would m inside there. So when we're squaring it and making it positive and then rooting it, we've got to do m minus 2, all minus, and then a minus m here, and then we can simplify it from there, and you would get minus 2m plus 2, or just to make it look a little bit neater, 2 minus 2m. Join me for the next video in order for you to practice the skills I've just gone through before I go through the answers myself. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.